can you learn a whole computer science degree from one of the most prestigious universities ever, MIT, all by yourself during a single year? And the answer is, of course not. But my guest today can. And moreover, my guest today thinks that he can teach you how to do it. His name is Scott Yאנג. Hi, and welcome to my channel. My name is Roy Yosevich. And in this channel, I host and speak with the most influential and interesting people from all around the world to discuss science, creativity, learning, psychology, and artificial intelligence. If this is your first time here, please consider subscribing and hit the bell button. And my guest today is the ultra learner, Scott M. Yאנג, or Scott Yאנג is the author of Ultra Learning, which is a great book, and all the big guys in the learning industry knows Scott, and including Barbara Oakley, and including James Clear, and including all the big guys know and admire Scott's work. So, Scott, many thanks for joining me today. How are you?
Oh, I'm great. Well, it's gonna be hard to follow that introduction, but I appreciate all the kind words you said about me.
Oh, don't mention. Now, I mentioned you in two of my books, and one book that I called Enlightenment version 2.0, which basically encapsulate all the transformation that the educational system has been going through, including the MOOC revolution, etc., the massive open online courses. But just one chapter before the MOOC revolution, I spoke about YouTube and MIT OpenCourseWare. And then I mentioned a young entrepreneur named Scott Yאנג, who had a unbelievable challenge to take all the courses MIT offered through its MIT OpenCourseWare and just learn them by himself. And all the courses, something like 30 courses, doing just a single year. Now, it sounds crazy. Why did you do it?
Yeah, so I went to school and I got a business degree. And when I was thinking about going to study business, I was also thinking that I might like to learn computer science. And when I graduated, I was a little bit like, I wish I had studied computer science. I felt like, I don't know, I wasn't a fan of all the stuff that I learned in business school. And so I was thinking, you know what, I wish I knew how to program. I wish I, program well. I knew how to do a little bit of programming. And I was considering going back to school. I was actually looking into it, like what would it be like to register as a mature student and go back and do it. But I mean, that's not super appealing, especially if you already have one undergraduate degree. Getting a second, sometimes it just feels like you're dragging out the college experience. You're not 18 anymore. You want to just kind of get on with your life. And I had encountered one of these MIT OpenCourseWare classes. And I was like, well, this is brilliant. Like, this is taught by, the best person in the field, like someone who's going to win like a Fields medal, and they're teaching you algorithms. And the classes often had assignments, so problem sets with solutions, and they often had final exams with solutions. And so this was just kind of a sort of an interesting thought experiment to me, is like, well, there's a lot of classes on here. Has anyone ever tried to just take them, and admittedly, just passing a final exam is not, I don't want to make the claim that that's all of the college experience and you can reduce it down to that.
While you are speaking, just a second, while you are speaking, I'm just going to show you the MIT OpenCourseWare, and there are a lot of courses over there. So please
tons,
Yes, keep talking, please.
So I don't make the claim that, obviously group presentations are important, and, essays and labs and getting to work with the big robot that has, like, there's lots of things in the MIT experience that I didn't get. Let me be clear about that. But I thought it was very interesting because if you were able to pass all the exams in a program, presumably you would have learned at least some of it. I think it'd be very hard to claim that you learned like nothing or nothing of importance if you did that. And more importantly, you would have covered what was learned. So it kind of, even if there was maybe some experience that was missing, you'd have this kind of breadth that where you're like, well, I know what's in that degree program. I know where I'd go next if I wanted to get better, this kind of thing. And so this really intrigued me. And I thought this was a fairly obvious thought. MIT is a school that people pay hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to attend, and it's super prestigious, and they're posting all their education for free. And I know a lot of people just want the credential, but presumably people want to be elite engineers and programmers as well. And so I was thinking, someone must have done this before. And I looked around and it didn't look like anyone had done it before. And that really got me interested, because how often in life do you encounter a situation where
you are the first
obvious thing, no one's done it, right? And so this got me really excited. And so the doing it in 1 year was, admittedly now I'm a bit older and a little bit more maybe mature, I do see it as being a little bit more gimmicky about the process. But the basic idea was, well, if you're not attending the classes, if you're just watching the lecture videos, and you can watch them at 2 times the speed, and you can watch them at home in your pajamas when you wake up at 7 in the morning and just get through the class. And if you can do an assignment and grade it immediately and learn from feedback right away, rather than waiting 2 weeks until someone sends it back to you. If you can do in a final exam as soon as you're ready, rather than, waiting until the exam date and showing up at that date and this kind of thing, then, maybe you could do it faster too. And so learning techniques and studying strategies had been a major part of my writing effort and my thinking when I was in university. It was a major part of my blog. And so this just seemed like a good kind of experiment. And it was a lot of work. So I want to be clear, because sometimes people will come up to me and be like, how do I do this in 1 year? But I can only put like 1 hour an evening. It was like, no. It was about like 50, 60 hours a week. So it was definitely intensive. But I loved it. It was just a life-changing experience for me. I think that it really showed me that you have the ability to learn so much more than you think you do. And that you have the ability to learn a lot of things that you might think in your head naively, well, no, I'd have to be at MIT. Like I'd have to go somewhere to do it, rather than something that I could take the initiative and do it myself. And so my basic feeling is that, the internet, the fact that we have so many courses available online, has created an immense opportunity for people who are eager and willing to learn. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to take up that opportunity. And that's sort of the subject of my book, and about how, learning can be challenging. But at the same time, I think it presents this sort of profound opportunity, so that if someone really wanted to study a lot of different topics at depth, you could do it, for relatively low cost and relatively low, inconvenience. You could do it on your own timetable. And so this was something that I think was really powerful for me in shaping how I thought about learning, how I think about higher education. And I mean, I think some of the ideas I had about it when I did it about 10 years ago, I have shifted since then. So I'm always changing my thinking on learning a little bit, but I still stand by that as being a project that I'm proud of, and something that was at the very least a great experience.
Okay, yeah. Now it's been 6 or 7 minutes into the conversation, and I think that this is a great place to introduce the elephant in the room. Now, many people consider MIT OpenCourseWare to be a complete failure, and the reason is that almost no one takes the courses, although they are great. And you can see, the decrease between, lecture number 1 and lecture number 2, all the way to lecture number 17. So you start with lecture number 1, and it's like 20,000 people, and lecture 17 is 400. Yes. So and the elephant in the room says basically the following. So you managed to do it 32 or 30 courses in
33. Yeah.
33, and it's a very hard word for Israeli to say 33. 40 is much better. Now, because of two qualities that you have, one is supreme intelligence or high intelligence, because I know I have a PhD in computer science. I know that if you don't have high intelligence, and I know that the MIT tests are quite challenging. So if you actually pass or even succeed in those tests, it means something about you, and you are kind of men who are capable of understanding those abstract ideas. And the other thing is perseverance or grit, or as you call it in Israel, a big butt to sit on. Now, if you don't have those two qualities, so basically, again, MIT OpenCourseWare is a complete failure. So my question is, what message can the average Joe can extract from your endeavor?
Right. So I think both of those things you said are true. I think that I don't really have much thoughts about my own intelligence, but I definitely know that MIT is hard classes, right? And so I'm not making the claim that if everyone who is takes longer to go through something like this isn't that's not my point. I'm not trying to discourage people or do this in a showy way. It was just for me, just kind of an experiment in possibility. And so I think that's important to highlight, because I think sometimes people can get a little too fixated on, I want to be able to do exactly the same thing. And I don't think that that's necessarily realistic. My feeling is that, when I watch someone who is excelling at any domain, I don't necessarily think to myself, I should be able to do exactly the same thing. But I do appreciate that, if I understand how they're doing it and how they're approaching it, maybe I can emulate some of that. So this is something I think that's true in all learning domains. If you see someone who's an elite athlete, elite musician, elite chess player, I don't see a Magnus Carlsen game and be like, therefore I can be the world grandmaster, at 17 or something like that. But maybe I would learn something about how chess works from him. And so that's what I try to do in my book, is not really make the argument that, everyone could do the MIT challenge the way that I did it, but that there are some principles there that probably apply. So one of the ones that's really interesting is that, this is 10 years ago, I was watching the lectures at a faster speed. And many people wrote to me making a claim, you're not going to understand anything when you watch them at a faster speed. And I was like, that doesn't seem to be true. But it's kind of hard to deny that sort of argument. Well, it looks like there was just recently, 10 years later, a study published showing that actually when you watch lectures at 1.5 to 2 times speed, you mostly can comprehend it, that your ability to comprehend is much better than people's ability to speak. This doesn't mean that you necessarily understand everything in depth, but that was also true at that 1 time speed. And so this was something that I think was very interesting.
I must tell you that I have a teaching assistant who takes 2 separate degrees simultaneously. So one in computer science and the other in psychology. Right. And he has a lot of courses each year, and he put the courses on 4 times.
4 times. 4 Depends on the person. 4 times can sometimes be incomprehensible. Yeah.
Yes. And he told me so he cannot listen to my lecture on 4 times. So my lecture is only on 3 times. Okay. Now, the other thing you mentioned in your famous TEDx talk, you've mentioned 3 conclusions from this experience. Now, one conclusion is that an Ivy League education, and I think that these are your words, is like a Michelin restaurant. It's great, but first you don't pay just for the food, you pay for many other things. Yeah. And the other, you don't go to a fancy restaurant every time that you are hungry. So you need to have the skill to learn by yourself, because sometimes you just can't go back to the university. It's not possible. It's impossible. And the other thing, which I think is great, that many people said, yes, but if I go to MIT, if I actually go, and it was pre the COVID pandemic thing with all the Zoom online teaching, if I go there, I can have this human feedback. But what you discovered is that if you have the solutions handy, this feedback is A, much faster, and B, much better in the context of learning. So if you could please elaborate on the second point, because I think it's extremely important.
Yeah, so I'm trying to remember the order of my points. The second point was about every time you go to eat, you don't go to the Michelin star restaurant.
No. The second point was just that if you have the solution handy, so
that one, right?
Actually make a progress.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting idea. So first of all, I also want to say that it's clear that having a tutor or coach or someone to give you individual feedback is good. I'm not making the opposite claim. What I am claiming is that that's not actually present in most universities. That yes, you can go to office hours and get a little bit of help from a busy professor on one of your, there's no one sitting next to you and helping you on each of these problem sets. Maybe you can, like twist the arm of one of your classmates to do it for you. But I know my university experience. I know the university experience of many people. And I'm like, well, you're mostly on your own. I mean, you get a little bit of help here and there, but that's about it. And so this myth that higher education is this just like intensive dialogue between students and professor is just BS. That's not actually how most universities are run. You're sitting in a class of 300 people, you take notes, and then you go do the assignments, you hand them in, you get feedback 2 weeks later, you do the exam, and you get whatever grade you get I would say the modal experience. Now you can seek out professors, you can do things. I don't want to say it's impossible, but I just want to say that this kind of critique of online education that like, that there's some beauty of in-person learning where it has all this rich feedback and dialogue, I just think is nonsense.
Plato and Aristotle walks down the aisle and speak.
It would be great if it were true, but it's not. And I think, the sort of elephant in the room a little bit is, why does in-person learning work better? Well, because you have to do it, because people force you to do it, because if you don't do it, you won't get your degree and you won't be able to get your job and all this kind of stuff. So this holding MOOCs to this very differential standard where honestly the credentials are a lot weaker, I think is just a really unfair idea. If you remove the credentials from Harvard and still had the in-person classes, I don't think you'd see much difference. That's my personal opinion. So I don't think it has anything to do with the in-person learning environment. That's true at college. I think at the lower grades, the in-classroom environment's a lot more important because younger kids have less self-regulation abilities. A lot of teachers will know that in, elementary, primary school, a lot of it's classroom management, keeping kids on task, this kind of thing. But at the university level, the assumption at least is that kids do this and that they should be able to do it. And so there isn't as much support provided. You're not working on your assignments in the lecture class, you're working on them at home, which is that's exactly what I was doing. So I think that's one thing to get straight, is that it's not that feedback is bad. It's just that you don't actually get that much feedback in higher education. And the other thing is that, and this is something that I've actually come to change my mind about since I did the MIT challenge. And this, it's a bit of a subtle point because it doesn't really influence my practical advice, but it changes the mechanism considerably. So my thinking in the class is that I recognized from a very early stage that having problem sets with solutions was in some cases more important than having access to the lectures. That if I wanted to pass the actual exam, having problem sets with solutions was much more valuable than having the lecture, because the lecture you could often infer from the problem sets. It was very difficult to infer the solution procedure of problems just from the lectures.
Active recall, guys, active recall is much more important than rereading. Active recall. And this is basically what Scott is saying right now. Test yourself.
Well, here's the interesting thing is that there's been a lot of research recently on cognitive load theory on what's called the worked example literature. And so I was very much under the impression that, well, the ingredient here is what you're saying is this active recall. It's the struggling through the problem set. And I still think that's important. I'm not saying that active learning, I think, is still important. But it looks like the sort of secret sauce in that is much more having the solution and having what is called a worked example, which is not just this is the answer, but this is how you got the answer. And what this kind of shows is that to be able to ask questions, what we really need is answer to someone doing that kind of problem and seeing how they do it. And so there is a kind of allure in higher education, a little bit too much focus on here's a broad theory and here's some general principle, and then like now go out and apply it to a million different problems. And what I think that we are learning when we're doing things is a lot closer to, well, you have a library of kind of specific problems that you know how to solve. Now, again, the theory, the background knowledge is also very important, but I think that that's super important. And given this sort of emphasis on having the solution, this also casts the MIT challenge in a bit of a different light, because I was sort of, okay, well, I do the problem and then I look at the solution and I would do this feedback loop. And I think that's very good. But if you look at the worked example literature, you can see why the traditional college approach, where you do the problem in a homework set, you do all of the problems, you hand it in, you wait till it's marked, you get your feedback like 2 weeks later, why that doesn't work as well. Well, it's not even that you've already forgotten, but it's if the ingredient for learning was seeing the solution, if that was the really pivotal ingredient, and you're getting it long after it matters, where you don't even really need to look at it because whatever, that assignment's done, I'm not having to do that again. You can see how that's detrimental to learning. So I think that my sort of vision of what a better educational approach would be is I think that the most important ingredient would be for professors and for people to decide what are the kinds of problems that we want people to be able to solve after having taken this class. This is particularly true in math. I mean, some classes it's less problem oriented, but in like a computer science class, that's very, very clear what we want people to do. And to give people a lot of problems plus solutions. So just like if you had a huge library of these, you could learn much, much more efficiently because you'd be able to master all the different problem types through this sort of tight feedback loop. Whereas what we typically do is we give people sort of very vague general instructions, get them to struggle on a problem for a really long time. And, you know, the struggle can be beneficial, but then we delay the feedback for, you know, weeks sometimes. And it's not surprising that learning becomes a lot harder. So it's kind of interesting. I did the MIT challenge a lot on what I intuitively thought would be the right approach. And it's very interesting seeing now, so much later, some of the psychological rationales that I was not aware of for why certain methods might work better than other methods.
And guys, if you want the research, it will be available just in the description of this video. Now, I want to mention two things about what you just said. One, that basically what you said is that there is a big pivot dominant in a pivot factor in deliberate practice, that you need a coach who can fix or change or say, listen, you did it correctly, or you didn't do it correctly. And this solution aspect of that, okay, I didn't do it correctly. Okay.
Yeah.
So this leads us to the theory of deliberate practice. And the other thing, which is extremely important, and I always tell my students that there is a huge difference between going through the problems and with the problems with the solutions, or try the best you can to tackle the problem by yourself. And then after you cannot do it anymore, or you think that you solved it, then just after watch and see the solution and compare with the solution.
So this is a very interesting debate that's currently being had in kind of educational circles, this sort of debate about how much time should you spend struggling on a problem versus just being shown the way of solving it. And I tend to think that the debate's a little bit more pedantic than it ought to be, because I think that there's a benefit of the sort of active process of learning. It seems to help with attention. It seems to help with you paying attention. If you didn't fail at the problem, it's hard to see what you would have tried, you know, it's hard to see that. So I think that there is a benefit to that. But I think that the key is that you have to view it as a loop. You have to view it as a sort of a practice. This was the correct way to do it loop. And the tighter that loop can be, I think that generally you resolve all of these problems. So if you're really struggling with problem sets and you have lots of problem sets, then I would probably go to the solution faster. But it is something that, you know, you definitely want to avoid going to the solution immediately throughout the entire learning process, because then you're not really going to develop this sort of active retrieval. So the idea here is that if you make this the fundamental unit, sort of do some practice, see how it's done. It's kind of amazing that this actually covers a substantial fraction of learning. And I think this kind of goes against how maybe some people might think about it. Now, I think there's another separate issue of, well, how relevant are the things that you're practicing in university to the things that you want to do in real life? But at the very least, I think that, you know, if you're going to learn a difficult mathematics class, this kind of practice loop is going to be essential. And so this was a major factor. Now, I want to talk about something just very briefly, because you mentioned it before about, you know, well, most people don't use OpenCourseWare. And I would say, I think the major reason for it is that OpenCourseWare is not as user-friendly as Coursera. There was a lot more stitching together. I had to do a lot more work to make the curriculum work. So I think part of that's on OpenCourseWare for being more difficult. And then second, I think the problem is that most people are not ready for MIT classes. Like to do MIT's intro calculus class, you'd have to have probably done well in AP calculus in high school. And most people aren't at that level. So I really recommend Khan Academy, because I think Khan Academy is brilliant for getting up to the MIT level. So if you look at an MIT class from OpenCourseWare and you're like, oh, wow, I don't understand any of this, Khan Academy is like your middle school, high school, early university.
Even college.
Yeah.
I think that they teach in Khan Academy differential equations, and they teach calculus, not that in the high school level, but much deeper. And I totally agree with you that the courses on Coursera are much more digested, or much, let's do it the simple way.
Well, they can be watered down, but yeah. They can be watered down, but I think Coursera courses can be watered down. But I think that the main thing they have going for them is that they're just like way user friendlier, like if that's a term. Like MIT courseware, like I'll tell you, like there was a lot of classes that were, all right, how am I going to do this one? Because it's like there's no lectures, there's a few problem sets, there's an assigned textbook, and it's like, okay, this is a real
no solution for the test.
There's a real like stitching together here. And like I remember going on so MIT has their OpenCourseWare, which is for the public, but they also have this website for their students called Stellar. And I remember getting an MIT student to give me like he would go onto the Stellar website and access the exams with solutions that were only available for MIT students, and he would like send me for a couple classes where it was like, okay, I can't do this if I don't have the exam. And so I think he sent me one, or maybe it was one for like chemistry or something, I don't know what it was, but there was a couple ones where I was doing this. So definitely I think there's still a ways to go, I think, in making it possible. But I think this was more an existence proof than a like, this is a fully versatile solution for everyone. It's just, this is possible to do, rather than, I'm going to advocate everyone do it exactly the way I did.
Now, I want to emphasize something that some of my audience may be unaware. You didn't actually go to MIT to take the final exam. You just printed the final exam. You took the final exam in your pajamas, yes, in your
sometimes I put on
house,
pants,
yes, and then you checked the test for yourself. You must be brutally honest about this, and you check. Yeah. And if you passed, you passed. If you didn't, you.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is probably one of the areas which I would say is, I don't want to say contentious, but definitely an area where there's an element of judgment here. Now, fortunately, MIT solutions, they're pretty cut and dry. So it's kind of either got or you didn't. The area where is a little shakier is, okay, say there's a big multi-step problem where it's A, B, C, and D, and you put a minus sign. You put a minus sign where you weren't supposed to. What mark should you get? And so when I was doing the MIT challenge, I used the rubric that I felt was applied to me when I was in university. And maybe that's not fair. I know some people would have preferred a much more rigorous, like any calculation errors, the whole problems were 0. Some people have said that to me. Now I took it as, okay, well, this problem's worth 5 points. If I made an arithmetic error, then it's like -2 or something. And so what I would do is I would do the exam under normal conditions. So if it was a 3-hour exam, I did 3 hours, no materials with me. And then I would grade it, and I would decide on a rubric ahead of time. So like, this is what I'm going to penalize myself if I made this kind of mistake. And so if I look at it, there were 33 classes, and it was several years later. I was thinking about this. This was prior to publishing Ultra Learning. I was like, well, you know what? What if I did take the extremely like rigorous, if you make any mistake, it's, there's no part marks kind of approach. And when I went through it, there were 6 classes, 6 final exams that would have gone from a pass to a fail if I did that. So you can think about it that way, that the sort of 27 or 33. So I'm not trying to make the claim that I was perfect. I'm not trying to make the claim that I got 100% on all the tests. They were definitely hard. And so for a lot of them, I was going for a pass fail benchmark. And so I think for me, if I have to reflect on it from this sort of distant vantage point, the major weakness I had doing the MIT challenge is that for the calculus and algebra heavy classes, my procedural fluency with doing the complex equations was not as good as it could have been. And so if I had gone a lot deeper into physics, that would have hurt me. So when I did this quantum mechanics project later, and I wanted
to address the quantum mechanics. Study with me 4 hours quantum mechanics, with a bracket. Yes. So I wanted to address this endeavor afterwards. Now, would you say that universities should let people like you take the final exam? Now, it's not going to be like a legal MIT degree, because MIT degree costs like $100,000, but it might be an MITx, okay? And MITx will let you just sign up or just pay to do the final exam, and then you have like a diploma. You get an MITx diploma. Would you think that this move will be beneficial to students or just beneficial to Scott Young?
Like doing sort of a degree by examination. Well, I personally have always been of the opinion that a lot of university has a lot of waste. It has a lot of, adhering to certain traditional standards that make it, they have lofty pedagogical rationales for things, but I think if you just nakedly look at it, the higher education system creates, the waste that it creates is punitive for a lot of students, requiring all students. Like here's the best example. If you study in a foreign country, your engineering degree, and then you come to America or Canada, they often make you repeat large parts of the degree. And a lot of people who, have kids and they have to do jobs and this kind of stuff, don't do it. And so what do? They get a job as a janitor, a taxi driver, doing something else. And they're just like, you know what? Yeah, it's just too much work. And so I think this is enormous societal waste. And so I definitely am in favor of the idea that if you can pass the exams or whatever exams people dream up for that they think would measure that the competence, then you should be able to get at least something that tells people, no, I know how to do this, or I have this knowledge that I'm expected to have. And so I tend to favor that approach. Now, the approach that I took, admittedly, I don't think is going to pass that bar. Like, marking an exam yourself, there's just too much room for sloppiness and cheating there. As I said, this was more an existence proof than a fully worked out solution. But I do like the idea of schools offering, it doesn't have to be an MIT degree, but maybe an MITx diploma or something. Now, the question is what the labor market will think of these degrees. And that's another question. So, but I leave that up to people.
I had this question. Yes, I had this question. How do you achieve an academic achievement, that will impress employers without academic degree? So one thing that I can think of is like the Coursera certification, TensorFlow certification, AWS certification, etc. And Coursera gives a lot of those certification on LinkedIn. But what do you think? Should we think about this whole thing, this whole certification thing differently? Because I want to learn, and I want, there is like the famous Elon Musk quote, I don't care where you go to school, which university you went to. I just need results. I just need to know what you are capable of doing. And is there a way that you think that we can go in this very positive direction, that I can show you what my academic achievements are without having to go through the entire process of a degree and money?
Mm-hmm. Well, this is something that I've thought a lot about, and I think it's a complex issue, because I think it's arguable, at least, that a lot of the academic skills that you learn in university that I think have, learning how physics works or learning how biology works, these are all like important ennobling activities. So don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that, learning them is a waste of time. I love learning these things, but it's also pretty clear for me that they don't play a major role in your productivity on the job. And what plays a major role in your productivity on the job? It's being competent at work tasks. And there is some argument to be made for different layers of expertise so that, you know, to be able to perform more flexibly in more situations, you need to have a deeper foundation. You know, the argument that the person who can code up a website in HTML is different from the person who can write a machine learning algorithm that will solve some important problem. You know, the latter is going to require a lot of advanced math and theory that the former does not. But I think it's also true that there's probably a lot of things that we teach in school that are academic skills that are merely academic. They do not actually translate to professional performance. And so why do universities put such a premium on going to school? Well, I think it's because it's this package deal. You learn some useful skills, you learn a lot of useless skills, you learn some you're socialized into a kind of a more elite strata of society. You demonstrate to people that you are willing to conform to an intellectually demanding task for a number of years. So there's all this sort of weird mix of grab bag of signals you're showing when you go to university. Now, I think the major problem right now is that if you have professional competence in a task, it's very difficult right now to signal that credibly. That what can you do? Well, you can say that you have X years of job experience.
I tell you what.
How do you get the first job?
Just a second, Scott. I tell you what you can do, in my opinion. And again, I myself also thought about it in depth. But first, there is a great quote from Thomas Sowell. He said that the best thing about Harvard education that you are never intimidated from anyone with Harvard education. So I think that it's reached the strata of society. Yes, I'm that kind of person who goes to Harvard. Now I know, and I think I know how to do it in computer science. I don't know how to do it in physics. I don't know how to do it in other disciplines as well. But in computer science, you have Stack Overflow, and you have Kaggle, and you have all those things that if you have a high profile and GitHub, so if you have a high profile on Stack Overflow and GitHub and Kaggle, then you signal something very, very important, and it's like a giant flash in the night. Yes, I want Kaggle competition number 2 or number 1. Okay, now all the employers know exactly who you are and what you are and what your worth is. But I don't know how to extrapolate this and how to transfer this method to other disciplines as well.
Yeah, so I think computer science and programming and software engineering in general is a really peculiar field, because it is a very high skilled profession where people earn lots of money, but it has somehow managed to avoid the inevitable trend of professionalization that turns every profession into a guild where there's all these gatekeepers that get to say who is in and who's out of the club, and they get to make what amounts to, in some cases, almost like hazing rituals. Just like they're not really related to making you more productive. They just want to discourage new people entering. So I tend to be more of a fan of how can we make it so that we can demonstrate that we can do a skill, and then sort of leave the evaluating of how we know someone can do a skill with the educating, just decouple that. Because I think the problem right now is that universities are in the educating business and they're in the credentialing business. And those two functions are so fused, it's very difficult to separate them. And I think that this is made worse by the fact that, for most high skilled professions, it's very difficult to practice it without the appropriate degree. So you can't be a lawyer, you can't be a doctor, you can't be an engineer, you can't be, I could just make a list of all the things that you can't do without it. You can't be a hairdresser in the United States if you don't have a license. So there's definitely, I don't want my surgeon to not have proper training. So I'm not making that claim that anyone should just be able to do it if they, can figure it out. But I think it would be in the benefit of society if we could make efforts to decouple these functions, to the evaluating that someone would be good at doing X or has the skills to do X with the training of X. Because the training, it seems like there's lots of different ways you could approach it. And there seems like there is a lot of room for innovation. there's a lot of room for different ways of teaching people things.
And we are only speaking so far about the science, not about the humanities, because I don't know what those guys are doing there. Now, Peter Thiel once said that technology is all about doing more with less, and education is all about doing less with more. And I think that this strike to the point, because, and he asked, if Ivy League education, if Harvard is so great in producing best scholars, and the smartest people, why don't you just make Harvard twice as big and take much more students? And the reason that they don't want to. So there is something profoundly strange about higher education. Now, this is a big discussion, and with your permission, let me go over to another thing that you write about and talk about, and which is motivation. Now, when we say motivation, okay, I have like the Josh Kaufman, the first 20 hours school, that whenever we start to learn a new skill, the learning curve is rapid, but after approximately 20 hours, the learning rate decreases. So it's like a log function. And so Josh Kaufman basically says, the gist of what he says, that focus on the first 20 hours, since motivation mainly comes from previous success. So if you have big success, now I cannot harness I can't harness this method to what you're doing, because you invest much more than 20 hours in your MIT challenge and then in the Learn Quantum Mechanics challenge. So how do you keep the motivation way beyond the first 20 hours?
That's a good question. I think motivation is a deep issue. So what you talked about is definitely true. We're motivated based on past successes. And so my advice to anyone who is approaching something in a domain where they have low confidence would be to start building early successes. Now, it's a little bit tricky because when, it's what do you count as a success, right? But the idea here is that, you can accomplish more ambitious things when you're more confident, because the confidence allows you to persist through a lot of failure and discouragement. Whereas when you don't feel like you're good at something, you kind of say to yourself, oh, this is impossible. I can't do it.
Success brings success.
Yeah. Basically. So I really like, there's this rule that the educational psychologist Barak Rosenshine had, and he did this review of effective teaching strategies. And what he found was that, this is in classrooms, but I think it applies elsewhere, was that effective teachers kept success rate of their students around 80%. So and I'm talking about like individual questions, individual things, you should be able to get them right about 80% of the time. And I thought that was very interesting because certainly in the new phase of a pursuit, you may not hit 80%, but it does show that at that level, you can kind of sustain motivation just by prior competence. Now, you can get into situations where the success rate is going to be lower than that, but I think it's one of those compensatory functions that, well, those are going to be frustrating situations for you. And so if you have no other route, then that's still the way that you have to go forward. But it does mean that, well, yeah, of course, it's going to be more demanding on you. You're going to have more confidence. It's going to have to be a project that's more important to you. You're going to have to devote more resources, make it a priority in your life, et cetera, et cetera. But I think the extent to which you can break down a learning goal into actions you can take with 80% success is a useful heuristic. I think
you say that this is similar to the flow theory of Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi.
Yeah, Csikszentmihalyi is
it's basically the flow theory, or no? Because flow theory is something completely different. Because
I don't know. For me, the flow theory was always about the lack of deliberateness. I know that some people view flow in terms of a level of success, but personally, I'm not Csikszentmihalyi. So I can't say what his theory meant exactly, but my understanding of it was that flow was I consider flow to be really closely related to fluent performance of a skill. And so one of the reasons I'm not always a fan of flow when it comes to learning is that the idea of flow is that you are sort of relying on kind of well-honed skills that you don't have to think about a lot to perform a task. So there's not that much troubleshooting, problem solving. It's very much kind of, I do this. So you can think of it athletics or even a lot of intellectual activities where you've done it quite a bit. Now, maybe I'm wrong, but I think that, definitely there's points in the learning process. I know Anders Ericsson of Deliberate Practice was often a critic of Csikszentmihalyi, and like in his view, a lot of what we're doing when we're learning is sort of going against the flow impulse, that we're sort of, okay, I have to deliberately fix this thing that I'm doing wrong. So, you can definitely think of that in situations where, okay, if I'm speaking a language, for instance, and I know that I'm sort of speaking ungrammatically in a certain way, I might decide, okay, this conversation, I'm going to fix all those grammatical mistakes. That's very much not flow, right? That's a very deliberate interrupting your own fluent performance kind of.
Tell me about this.
Well, I think there's trade-offs to it. So we can get into the whole deliberate practice and, all of this kind of stuff as well. But I think the 80% rule is a little bit more broad than what psychological state you're in when you're studying. It's just more of an idea that if you have things that are much more difficult than that, then it's very easy for people to tune out and just decide, this is too hard for me. I can't do it. I give up.
But
and
why,
I don't think... Mm-hmm.
Just sorry, but how does this keep the 80% level of correctness coexist with the learning curve? Because after, when you learn quantum mechanics, or when you learn very hard abstract, or when you learn how to draw faces, which is great, like you follow the route of Richard Feynman. And when you try to do it, sometimes it's either that you can't achieve 80% because it's too difficult, or you can achieve 80%, but you're just going over and over and over the same thing over and over again. So there is a problem.
Well, I mean, again, this is the challenge, is that it's often difficult to break down a learning task into that sort of increment. Now, I think, again, the idea that learning is steepest at the beginning is probably true. I don't think that, so the model he's talking about, this learning curve being an exponential, or, well, it's probably a power function, but that's a whole separate discussion. But the learning curve having that shape is true, but it's true mostly for learning a single thing. So, if you consider a component process, lots of things exhibit learning in that way, where you sort of quickly improve, and then it gets, so like, memory of a fact or performing a particular automated skill will go that way. But the thing is complex learning is more difficult than that, because you're always learning new things, right? So if you're learning a language, I don't know whether it necessarily follows that curve, because the issue is every single word is kind of like that sort of curve, right? So it always has that issue. And so my feeling about it is that, you were talking about the quantum mechanics challenge. Well, there's new content throughout the entire course, right? So you could, like, a degree is going to be 4 years, and you can have something that would take you 20 minutes to learn. And so I do think that Josh Kaufman is correct, that getting that foundation right, knowing how to start, is very important. I think that is very important for motivation, because it's those early moments that often, that first 20 hours, that determine whether you're going to stick with something. But I think it's also obviously true that many skills are going to take way more than 20 hours. I mean, I think the criticism of me that I agree with strongly is that, I go to Spain and we're speaking, okay Spanish after 3 months, and people are like, oh, well, you can learn any language in 3 months. And then the people who've spent, 16 years doing it be like, oh, this is BS. And it's like, well, of course, they're totally different things. Like, to be perfectly fluent at an educated level, that is going to take decades. And so I think skills have their own sort of natural timeline. And so it's kind of ridiculous to assume that, oh, I can compress any skill, any particular level of performance into a given time frame. But I think the idea of both Kaufman and myself, which I really stress, is how you get started with something, how you get the ball rolling, how you get your kind of grasp in a field is super important, because that's often the part that's trickiest. The hardest part of programming is I've never written a program before to the point of I can sort of autonomously write some of my own programs. Like, that transition's really hard,
And from then we move on to your next challenge, which was approximately 1 year after the MIT challenge. And it was 1 year. 3 months in Spain, in Brazil, yes?
Yeah, yes.
And in China and in South Korea.
Yeah.
Not North Korea, because you are back here with us. And the challenge was to 3 months, you and a friend speak no word in English, and just from the moment you land, you just speak the local language. So it was it was relatively easy or accessible in Spain and Brazil, but much, much harder in China and Korea. Now, I've read Benny Lewis. I've read Benny Lewis fluent in 3 months.
Yeah.
And which is a great book. By the way, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can. Of course. Can you hear me?
No, because there is like a big rain. So anyway, I've read Benny Lewis fluent in 3 months. And one thing that he speaks in the book, he said, you need first to define what fluent is. And many say, okay, fluent is not like being an Oxfordian English. And he said, I have a measurable metric, and this metric is B2, or I think it's A2, B1, it's so if I have a measurable metric of what learning is, it is much, much easier to learn the language. What do you think?
So fluency, I never used the word fluent in our project, and I did that on purpose because it means nothing. I would say technically fluency means that you're able to speak without major pauses. That would be, I would say, the strict definition of fluency. But it's very clear that you can speak without major pauses and not be particularly good in the language. So most people, when they think fluent, they think perfect. Or, you speak it like a native. And those are just such vastly different goals in my mind that to use a single word to describe it is misleading. Because if you say, oh, I was fluent in Spanish after 3 months, well, by the first standard, we were. I would say in most conversations, we were able to speak without noticeable pauses, with reasonable correctness. However, there's tons of stuff in the language that we couldn't do. Like I was, I have Don Quixote de la Mancha sitting on my bookshelf. I can't read it. It is a grind to get through one page of that book for me. But of course, a fluent Spanish speaker should be able to read that book. So that's an example of something I can't do. We would struggle in group conversations, right? When you have a conversation with someone who is a non-native speaker, you adjust your level. You make it easier for them to understand you. This is something we do naturally when we're speaking. But it also means that when 2 native speakers are talking, it's harder to follow the conversation. And so I don't want to make the claim that we had reached any level of perfection. I think anyone can watch the videos we were doing and see that we didn't reach that. But the point that I want to stress, and I think it's the more optimistic point, is that we were able to do a lot, and we were able to do a lot of things that I would say for most North Americans who have spent 2-3 years studying a language in school and would like to speak French or speak Spanish or something like this, they are imagining a level, I think, which is probably inclusive of the level that we reached in most of the countries. I mean, Korean was probably our worst, but even that was a level where you could carry on a conversation in Korean. I mean, not necessarily talking about like politics and stuff, but, you could get by. And so I think that there's a lot to be said for the approach that we took. I think that there's a lot of things that people have maybe misconceptions about it, but I think that this is the approach that I would advocate for language learning across the board, which is one that focuses on getting you into a situation where you need to use it to communicate. And need to use it to communicate. You're not going to want to use it. And I think that's where I differ from some other people who are like, well, we should never put too much pressure on the students to produce language. No.
Yeah,
you learn a language
have
through
the story of being in China without anyone speaking English, and you're just looking for the
China
person, for the Airbnb version. So yes, it's like you must speak the language, otherwise you will sleep in the street.
Now, this is something that I think is important to point out. I am not a fan of saying, well, you should attempt this immersion from zero. Attempting immersion from zero is the hardest possible point to do it. Clearly, if you'd spent 3 years studying it in school, that would be a relatively easy point to start immersion. And although easy might be relatively speaking there, I do think that people wait too long to start. So my kind of rule of thumb was that, well, for A European language, you could probably get started after a month or two of Pimsleur. For an Asian language, I think that you definitely want to do conversation practice in the beginning, but for a like switch my entire life into the language, you know, China, I did about 100 hours and it was still a bit of a grind in the beginning. And Korean, we did almost nothing. And I mean, we did make it work in Korea, but it was a lot of studying in our room alone, which we didn't need to be in Korea for that. So I think there's definitely a balancing point, but I think people tend to put the balancing point way too far in the future. So they spend 8 months with Duolingo and they haven't attempted one conversation yet.
Okay.
Like, why is my Spanish not very good?
You said in a recent interview, and many people say, guys, Pimsleur is great. But you said in a recent interview that you don't like Duolingo because you don't construct a sentence. And the single most important thing when getting the skill of a new language is to get this very word that you are looking for and put it in the right context or in the right place in a sentence. So if you could elaborate on this. So why Duolingo is inefficient for language learning, in your opinion?
My views on Duolingo have shifted. I think I really didn't like it when I started language learning. I thought, oh, this is just a toy that you play. This has nothing to do with language learning. I think I kind of, it's not my style. I wouldn't use it to learn a language. I wouldn't recommend it as a beginner resource. But I think the main thing it has going for it is that it's super easy. And so that's why people like it, you know. So I don't want to, I think I'm shifting because I feel like I was too hard on it. Well, there's zero benefit. I think there is some benefit.
It's not just, Scott, it's not just that it's super easy. I have gone through Pimsleur on French and Duolingo on French. And Pimsleur, I just heard the MP3, so I didn't know how to write anything in French.
That's true, yeah.
Duolingo gave me this how to write, or
well,
how
it's
to
also
read.
clear. I don't think the approach to learning a language would be to stick to Duolingo. So I think Pimsleur. Pimsleur also quickly reaches a level where it's kind of not helpful anymore. But I think the thing that Pimsleur did really well, which I liked, is that because you have to retrieve sentences from like whole phrases from their English equivalent, and they kind of really guide you through the pronunciation. And if you're actually doing it properly, you should be pronouncing it. The one thing you can be guaranteed after you've done a Pimsleur course is you will be able to utter the phrases in the Pimsleur course and you'll know what they mean. And you'll usually be able to do them with, I would say, people I know who have done Pimsleur pronounce things relatively well, because you're doing a very quick, it's that practice loop, right? It's the doing something, getting the feedback. That's what Pimsleur does. What does Pimsleur not do? Well, it doesn't do anything for writing or reading. And so particularly if that was important to you, then you're not going to get that from Pimsleur. You don't have, Pimsleur often has quite formal language. So not as big a problem with European languages, although like for French, you know, there's a little bit too much emphasis on vous voyez, that kind of thing. But like in Korean, it can be a real problem because in Korean, it's exclusively teaching you this extremely formal version, which is in some ways quite different. So not even just the grammar, but like whole nouns are different in the formal and informal register.
In French, they have enchanté de faire votre connaissance. What? What? We don't speak like this. What is German for
like it's,
enchanté de faire votre connaissance. Avec plaisir, oui.
But I think one thing that Pimsleur would do is that enchanté de faire votre connaissance, that phrase would be fluent. You would be able to say it in a thing. Duolingo, I don't think you would be fluent in anything after you did it. Now, but maybe that's not the purpose of Duolingo. I would think I was too critical on it initially because I thought, well, if you're not fluent, I'm like, what's the point? But I think it does give you sort of exposure to the language in an easier setting so that if you were later to become fluent, you probably would learn it a little bit faster. Now, how valuable that is, I don't know. I don't think it's particularly worth it. For me, I think what I would focus on would be a lot of, like, I tend to focus on how can I get to having a conversation stage very early, and how can I speak to people, because I think that that's the goal most people want. Now, that being said, that's also not the whole deal of language learning. So a criticism of the Benny Lewis, Scott Young approach would be that a focus on conversation practice omits listening practice. And in the long term, listening and reading comprehension is the hard part of language learning. Sorry,
even when you try to listen, because in French, you know, the guys in Paris speak I know whenever I try to watch a French movie, I cannot do it without the help of my wife. Now, if she like takes a sentence and just repeat it slowly, I can get it. But you know, during this slang thing, I just can't get it.
Yeah. So I do think that, so this was sort of an idea that I talked about in ultra learning, this idea of directness. And this turns out to be a much more complicated issue when I dig into the research on it. But the idea basically that if you want to get good at something, you need to match your practice to what you're trying to get good at. And so having conversations, you know, minus a rounding error is probably going to be the way to get better at having conversations. Now, there is some limits to that. You can get in a situation where you don't progress because you're too good at the conversations, which is sort of an opposite problem. So this is the deliberate practice kind of idea. But I think it's also very true that having conversations doesn't necessarily give you the abilities to watch movies and to listen to the radio and read novels and stuff. And so this idea that you do one activity for language learning and that will give you all the other activities has been a seductive one in second language acquisition. I know, you know, Stephen Krashen's whole input hypothesis, the idea that if people could had good fluent listening ability, they would get speaking for free. This was his big idea. And you look at bilingual education in Canada, and it's not true. You can be a totally fluent listener of French through French immersion classes and have very non-fluent production abilities. So I kind of think
transfer learning doesn't work, guys. Transfer learning doesn't work. If you want to be good at something, just practice on this specific thing.
Well, I think it does mean that there's a complicated relationship. So, you know, I had a conversation with this guy. I won't name him just in case he doesn't want me to share this, but he's a smart guy about learning Mandarin. And he made the claim that, well, yeah, but if you want to get really good at Mandarin, conversation practice is not, like, beyond a certain point, is not what you want to do. You want to focus on listening. And I think he's right in a way, in that there is a different problem that people like myself can get into, where once you get to the intermediate level, you can have these nice fluent conversations with people. Then how do you get really, really good at it? Well, it means that you have to make kind of complex sentences that educated people use. And that is not necessary for conversation. And so there is definitely, I think, an intermediate plateau. So my Year Without English project did not touch that. And I don't think we had anything useful to say about that intermediate plateau. But it does make me rethink the problem a little bit when, let's say someone who's, by the nature of the email they sent me, their English is quite good. And they say to me, well, how do I become totally, totally fluent? I think there's a slightly different process there, because I think the issue is that once you get to a competent level of the language, further progression can be hard because you're so good at it, because you're already, like, it's very difficult to find situations that force you to a level higher than what you already have. So I kind of started to notice that with my Spanish sort of near the end of the trip. And I've definitely started to notice with my Mandarin, but that was after the trip. That was more practicing it here. And so I think there is a sort of an ongoing process of improvement. And so the things that you need to do to get to a basic level are not always exactly the same things you need to do to master something. But with that caveat in mind, when I think about our project and I think about how most people approach language learning, and I think about the ubiquitous failure of language education in North America, I think, you know, find someone who speaks it, do the no English rule, can even be for half an hour at a time, use Google. Like the approach we took is what I would advocate. So I don't think for practical recommendations for beginners, I would change my advice too much.
So if you don't going on a trip to a foreign foreign state, so basically Pimsleur and italki, those
italki, I'm not sure. Yeah,
yes,
those are good. Italki is good. So another example, like I did a little project, like almost 2 years ago now, and it was with my wife. And so this was sort of beginning of the coronavirus pandemic. Everyone's on lockdown, and we're like, well, I wanted to learn Macedonian. Yeah. And so we did basically the no English rule at home, but it was just with each other. So when I would have work calls or talk to anyone else or, do anything, then, well, obviously I'm using English. They don't know Macedonian. And it worked pretty well. People can look at the thing that I did. Again, it's still just a beginner level. I would not say that I'm totally fluent in Macedonian either. But where I felt that helped me is now when I stay with my in-laws and they speak in Macedonian, I actually follow quite a bit of the conversation. Whereas before it would always be like, well, I just got to tune out because they're now talking in their language. And so this is something that, like, I think there's a misnomer that the active ingredient in the year without English was travel. It was the not speaking English. So you just need to find someone who wants to do it with you. You don't have to travel. That's not the active ingredient. I mean, there's a lot of great things for travel. Travel's a lot of fun. I mean, it's more fun to do it when you're traveling, but if you wanted to get good at it, that's the most important ingredient. And so even for people who, like, they don't have access to native speakers, if you can find someone else who wants to, like, practice English with you, and you just say, okay, for the next month, we're going to do this. We're going to meet 3 times a week and we're going to do this. That can be great. I know in other countries, they'll have like English corners where it's like a meetup where people go to and they just speak in English. This is very good. I don't think it necessarily gets you to an elite level of like the perfect fluency, but I think if you feel like you don't have a lot of confidence speaking, you don't speak fluently, you don't speak smoothly, this is the way to go.
Okay, now you spoke in your book, I think, about 3 things: your fact, concept, and procedures. And
right.
One thing that you speak about procedures in the context of learning the language is you need to do it correctly because you are going to repeat the sentence over and over again. Now, in my former life, I was a magician. Now that we have the pandemic, I'm not longer a magician, but in magic in sleight of hand magic it's extremely important, to do the right thing, to rehearse on the right movement, because practice doesn't make perfect, practice makes permanent. Mm-hmm. So it's not that practice make perfect. And if you practice the wrong T, the wrong TH, the wrong R, the wrong L over and over and over again, so you will get the habit of saying those wrong. Could you elaborate on this? Because I think it's...
that's definitely true. So this is a classic learning trade-off. Practice makes you fluent, but it can make you fluent at the wrong things. And so I have mixed feelings about this. So the sort of one extreme would be you need to secure a perfect foundation first because we don't want to risk having to unlearn something later. So in a language learning situation, that means you want to, before you start having conversations, you should be able to pronounce things perfectly. I think that's a little unrealistic and unattainable. I think it puts too much of a barrier for most people in actually performing the skill. But that being said, the other approach, don't worry about it, you'll just get better through practice, is also false. And so I think what I advocated, what I really focused on is perform to the best of your ability, but you need to be very sensitive to the idea that I'm probably not doing this very well and that I need to have corrections and improvements. So one issue from language acquisition is that we have limited cognitive memory, working memory. Our cognitive bandwidth is sort of limited. And so we devote it to different aspects of the speaking task. And overwhelmingly, when people are in speaking situations, they focus on meaning. And this can interfere with the process of focusing on pronunciation or focusing on grammar or focusing on that kind of stuff. So I think there's 2 ways you can cope with that. One way is to have a good tutor who you tell them, like, correct me. Tutors aren't always very good at correcting you, but correct me. And especially if, after I've said something, no, you should have said it like this and this kind of thing, especially if you're soliciting it, I think it usually works fairly well. Although sometimes language teachers avoid giving feedback because they've been taught that that's too demotivating to the student. But I think that feedback's fine if you solicit it. You don't always want it when you're not soliciting it. So it's something to ask for. And
again, feedback brings us back to the problem solution. Yeah. So you have this instant feedback. Listen, you don't say it. My wife can not only speak English well, but also teach my kid how to pronounce the words better. And my 12-year-old girl speaks in a more American accent than me because she got all the corrections, and I didn't get them when I was at her age, and now
it's hard. It's hard to change later. You know, so I'll give my big example of this was learning Mandarin. And Mandarin is very difficult for Westerners to learn to pronounce correctly. It has tones. It has tones which are very difficult to master. When you begin learning Mandarin, you often don't hear them. And it's very frustrating because I don't hear what you're like, you know, if they're really slow it down, you can go, you know, like ni hao, like you can hear the ni and how like differently. But if people are just saying it at a normal speaking pace, it's invisible to you. So that's one difficulty, is hearing the tones. The other difficulty is when you produce them, you often produce them wrong. And so there's a few strategies you can use for this. So one thing to do is, I think if you're struggling with pronunciation, really imitating someone exactly, like the way if you were doing an impression of them, is very helpful, because I think that this forces you to focus on the sort of submorpheme aspects of the pronunciation. So
great. Yes,
this is something that's
yes.
This is something that's very useful, is that the teacher will say something and you try to say it exactly the way they said it.
And
now,
this is why
never going to get
is so important.
I think that's why Pimsleur can be very good in the beginning. The other thing is, and I found this necessary for Chinese, it's sometimes a little bit of a step beyond. It definitely interferes with fluency, but seeing how someone actually creates the sounds with their mouth can be very useful. So for Chinese, one of the things that a lot of new learners struggle with is that there are 2 sh sounds and 2 ch sounds. Now in English, at least, there's only one for each. And so you hear them as the same, and it's exacerbated by the fact that they have the 2 ch's and sh's have different endings. They never have the same ending after. And so that means you can kind of fake it. You can say them all the same way because so for instance, there would be xi and shi. So and e are different sounds. So that's how you distinguish it. But also the shi and shi are different. One of them has the tongue curled to your back, almost like you're making an R, and one of them has it touching the sort of bottom part of your teeth at the gum line. And knowing that you make your tongue in a different position, you can practice that. Now, it's very difficult to, as adults, accent is one of the hardest things to learn, because the natural facility we have at learning to pronounce an accent perfectly fades, usually around 14, but it can go as long as 18 that you lose the ability to do this naturally. Now, you can do it, but then you're doing it the same way that adults, if you're an actor and you have a dialect coach or something, that's what you're doing. You're very deliberately moving your mouth in a certain position. So the challenge here is that there's lots of things going on in a language. There's grammar, there's pronunciation, there's vocabulary, there's usage, there's whether or not you're saying it in the idiomatic way or in a kind of like poor direct translation. There's a lot of factors. And so there is a balancing point between doing it correctly and performing it, to use it in the real situation. And so I tend to be more of the use it, because that's going to what gives you the fluency and automaticity. But I think there is definitely a risk of going too far in that direction. Well, I don't care about grammar because I can just talk to people. Well, yeah, you're not going to be very intelligent sounding.
What you said about the imitation is so true, because in Israel, we don't distinguish between double E and I. So to an Israeli ear, the word sheep and the word sheep sounds exactly the same. And now in Israeli, and when you say imitation, in Israel, we genuinely don't understand why Americans say cheese when they need to smile, because we can say cheese. Yes. So, and when you try to imitate, and when you see Donald Trump speaks with the entire face, or Eileen from Seinfeld, yes, he took it out. So this, I think the concept of imitation is so true. So it is yes.
Yeah. And so I think this is a major factor. And so, as I said, there is a trade-off. I think some people would take the idea, well, no, I want to learn it perfectly. So I'm going to just make sure that I'm pronouncing every single word correctly from the beginning. I don't think that's realistic or ideal either. And so what I think is that there's 2 processes at play. There is a practice process, and you are going to try to get it as close as you reasonably can to the performance. If you are not close enough, you should do some kind of practice or drills. So if your grammar is not correct, then you probably need to do the textbook assignments that you were given in language classes. If your pronunciation is not very accurate and you don't feel good about it, then you should probably do pronunciation drills and these kinds of things. But I see it as being something that you're kind of always doing the skill and then also perfecting routine aspects of it. So I think that the best attitude to have is one where you're mindful of your performance. And so I think particularly with skills that involve a kind of, they're not just discrete chunks. They're not just like mathematics problems where like you either, you either did the algebra equation 100% right or 100% wrong. There's like no shades of gray. But if we're talking about, painting a picture or
drawing a face,
speaking a language or anything that involves motor articulation, anything that involves perception, anything that involves some kind of continually varying aspect, there's a tuning process. And so I think you do want to devote some of your attention to improving that. And I do think it can create problems later if you're very fluent, because essentially the problem is that you have to get a lot worse to get better. Okay. And so for you to improve your accent to totally native levels, you would have to speak for a while in a very disfluent way. And that's very hard for people to do. So I think it can be a bit of a difficulty, and even for me, I think that would be a difficulty.
I think that the most important epiphany I had regarding my accent was the distinction between pronunciation and accent. And I came to realize that in this life, I won't have an American accent no matter what, but I can't improve my pronunciation. Okay. And by improving my pronunciation, make a easier job for Siri to understand me, make easier job for Google Translate. Okay. This is another different endeavor. I don't go for Brooklyn or I don't know, Manhattan accent. I won't have it. Okay. But I can't improve my pronunciation, which leads me back to another question that I wanted to ask you. There is a time for 2 more questions, Scott.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, so now before the recording, you had a great insight regarding how American perceive people who speak English and how American perceive people who speak foreign, not English language. Okay. So if you could elaborate on this, because this just blew my mind.
Well, this is, as I was saying, Americans, because they generally learn other languages so poorly, and I don't want to generalize too much. There's lots of Americans who learn language as well. So apologies for the Americans. I'm also lumping in Anglo-Canadians, which I am one of. So this is not just to criticize. Because we don't generally, like most people don't learn a second language that they didn't already, speak at home or something in American and Anglo-Canadian culture, there is a simultaneous tendency to be overly impressed by other English speakers who learn even a very bare minimum of another language, and to be sufficiently under-impressed at all the people who learn English pretty damn well. And so this is my good example of this. I didn't use this here, but my example, and I was talking about this example when I was in China to Chinese people, but I was using the example of Jackie Chan. And Jackie Chan is someone that, people are a little bit PC now. So no one, I think, is really like trying to make fun of Jackie Chan these days. But I definitely remember in the 90s growing up that like Jackie Chan and how he spoke English, people would be kind of making fun of him because his English was not perfectly fluent. However, you watch an interview with Jackie Chan, he can handle an interview. He can go on a talk show and handle a talk show interview. You go to China and handle a talk show interview, and you tell me how easy that task is. And so I kind of feel like we have this really weird sense that when we see Jackie Chan, we're like, oh yeah, his English is so bad. But if someone were at a much lower level of Mandarin, we would be duly impressed. And so I think that this is a tendency that people have. And so what learning languages has really taught me is to have this profound sympathy, I think, for people who have to express themselves in a non-native language, especially if, like you said, they haven't had a lot of opportunity to speak it. And so they don't live in the country or this kind of thing. And so, it's doubly hard for them. But the other thing I've noticed is that people use someone's fluency and articulateness as a proxy for their intelligence. And so I have a little story about this so when I was in Spain, I was dating this girl and we were only speaking in Spanish, and she was learning English. And so I was kind of like, she's like showing me the English book she's doing, this kind of thing. And she's feeling very self-conscious. So she'd never speak in English to me. And it was on, I think, the last night, and we were just about to leave Spain, and she was like, I've never heard you speaking in English before. Why don't you speak in English for a little bit? And I think I think it was just for that evening or something, we spoke in English, and she was just sort of like, oh my God, you sound so smart. Like, your English is so good. And it's like, well, what did you think? Did you think that I was just like an idiot this whole time? But I think it's just an automatic reflex that we associate someone who does not have a particularly high level of the language with being somewhat less intelligent. And I think it's this perception that makes language learning scary for a lot of people, that they are used to being seen as competent, articulate, and intelligent, and to suddenly seem childlike and immature and stupid is very hard for people to sort of bring themselves down to that level. And so I think the way that we kind of got away with it doing the Year Without English is that we just had a very irreverent quality to it. We were just kind of like, yeah, we're going to look like idiots for a whole year. And it was just kind of fun for us. We weren't taking it too seriously. And I think that allowed us to spend more time practicing. But I can also understand why someone who maybe has spent 6-7 years studying English in school, and then they have to go work in an environment where they need to use English regularly, and it's part of how they're perceived as professionals and stuff, this can be a very stressful experience. And so I don't really think there's a way around it. You just have to practice it and kind of get over that. But I think the more you can cut yourself some slack, and more you can cut yourself some slack and say, you know what, even though I'm not fluent, even though I'm not perfectly articulate, that doesn't mean that I'm not, smart. That doesn't I'm just going to accept that, yeah, people are going to form some misconceptions about me, but I'm just going to prove them wrong. I'm just going to have fun with it. And I think if you can have that kind of confidence and sort of a little bit of a lighthearted quality about it, language learning is a lot more fun. And I think ultimately you get better at it if you don't take it with the same sort of gravity that sometimes it can present to you if you're in such a situation.
And let me tell you, from my perspective, first, it's great. It's a great idea. Now, let me tell you from my perspective, there is like a hierarchy of accent. The British is better than the American, yes, and we all know it. Yes, you can
Canadian
say
is worse than the American.
You can say yes, no, but the Canadian is not English, etc. But Israeli is down there. The Israeli accent sounds not good. So it's not. It's like you are. It's like you're not smart, and it's not like the British accent. It's not like the German accent. Okay, so it's something different. And Israeli are considered extremely smart and intelligent. Hold the high-tech startup nation, but our language, it sounds like we are much stupid. It sounds like we are dumber than what we actually is. And the other thing that I came to notice like 3 years ago in the trip to Vienna, that my English level was sufficient to conversations, to making magic show, to give lectures, but it was insufficient to win debates. Okay.
Well, that can be true, yeah.
Yes. And then I thought, wow, because I'm not that articulated in English as in Hebrew, because in Hebrew I wrote 4 books and I can win almost any debate. And when I talked with Michael Shermer, I'm a religious Orthodox Jew, and this is like the publisher of Skeptic magazine for the last 20 years. And we had this conversation. I didn't even know how the book of philosophy that we all know what they're called in English.
Right.
So I totally understand you. Now,
you know what? I'll just say one thing, because I think this is a really deep point, and I think it's important to leave it on there, because this isn't just about language learning. I think all learning is about humbling yourself. It's about going back down and being bad at something. And this is true whether you're already proficient in a skill. We were talking about all unlearning things, and the fact that, okay, I have to become disfluent. I have to become not as good at this. And so I think this is not an incidental property to being a good learner. I think that being a good learner is about handling the emotional aspect of, I am now bad at this again. And I think as adults, we develop these little spheres of competence where we are good and we are respected and we're smart and we're knowledgeable. And then as soon as we get outside of that little sphere of competence, we just feel terrified. We feel vulnerable. We don't have that support anymore that builds up our identity. And I think this is a huge, huge barrier to learning. It's not a cognitive barrier. It's not because you couldn't learn a language. It's not because you couldn't learn computers or art or anything like that. It's because going back down and being bad at something again is a hard and scary process. And so I think that if you can learn to just love it and learn to just accept that that's just what it is, and you know, it's fine, I think that you'll be much better in the long run.
Okay, and I hope that in the next conversation, my English will be even better. Now, another again great endeavor that you had was to learn how to draw faces. Now, in the first chapter of your book, it's called no, it's not the first. It's chapter 4, but it's called Principle 1, Meta Learning. First, draw a map, and chapter 5, Principle 2. Focus, sharpen your knife. Now, with your permission, I want to ask you this very question because I wanted to know how to draw faces. So I started on YouTube. I say face drawing and of course the magic word tutorial. Yes. So face drawing tutorial. Meta learning is basically know what you should need to learn in this particular field. So let's say that I want to learn how to draw faces. Yes, and I saw the faces that you drew. It just blew my mind. And I have the book and I have like many tutorials. How do I choose? How do I start? How do I start? Right. And what is the best way to start? Is there just a single best way, or just I need to find my own path, or it doesn't matter because I don't know how to draw anything?
Right. Okay. So this is a good question. And it's interesting for me because I did it wrong in the portrait drawing challenge. So this is something I've changed my mind on. My original idea was that the important thing is getting lots of feedback. And that is important, but it is secondary to having a good method. And that it's kind of related to this, that if you have a different method, lots of practice with feedback, first of all, lots of practice with feedback will not really reliably lead to a good method. And second, the method really needs to come first, because all the practice can be wasted if you end up needing to use a different method to apply it. And so for me, I made most of the improvements after taking the Vitruvian Studios course. So I recommend checking out the Vitruvian Studio portrait course. Jamie... Vitruvian Studio. I mentioned it in the book, so we could probably put a link up after, but he is without a doubt one of the best portrait artists I know of. Like, if you look at his drawings, they're better than photographs. So I mean, I'm like, you know, you think mine is okay, like this guy's stuff is like, the actual photograph he's drawing from is worse than his drawing, which is scary. And I think what I learned from him is a particular method that allows him to achieve phenomenal accuracy. Now, it's a painstaking method. It's not for quick sketches. So if you wanted to be a caricaturist, you'd need a different method. But I think it is a really good tool for drawing generally. And in particularly, it's useful for getting that high accuracy in faces. So this is the challenge. There's lots of different methods. You don't know which one works. You don't know what's going to be good or not. And so I think there is a little element of trial and error here. But I think if I were to redo the portrait drawing challenge, where I would start is, what are the dominant methods that people use for face drawing? And there's several different methods, and some of them are kind of synthesis methods. So one of them is the grid method. The grid method also works for drawing other things, but it says you overlay a grid and then you match line segments within a grid. That works. I don't like it for drawing. I don't think it's not really how real artists draw. It's a little bit of a hack. There's tracing. A lot of people think that tracing is how good artists draw really well, which is not true, but it is a kind of like, you know, flattering assumption. Like, I remember talking to someone who was saying, oh yeah, all those Renaissance masters, they just used a complicated lens system to trace. And they just don't actually believe that you could draw that accurately just by looking at something.
Vermeer.
Yeah. I mean, there are some people who did it that way, and you can trace things, but I would say as well, like this method that I learned through Vitruvian Studios is better than tracing. Like I would be able to draw it better.
But how did you get now? Just a second. Now we have Scott Young tell me, listen, I went through this road, and this is better than this is better. But let's say that I don't have Scott Young.
Right.
Just beside me, and I'm willing to pay the money, and we have like this Udemy courses, okay? And I'm not familiar with the veterinarian course, and I don't know how much does it cost, and I don't know whether should I spend like, I don't know, $300 for a course. And I want, listen, can I just, start with a YouTube face drawing tutorial for beginners? Is this a good policy, or we should start with the best? The best method is delivered by the best teacher. I don't
think that there's a real way around it. I do think that what you're doing is you want to do a search to see what's out there, but you can't do a complete search, right? And the problem too is that the method is often locked behind a course, or maybe it's not even online. It's like, just some guy teaches it to his student through the art of, and it's in Venice and whatever, and you have to go there. So, I mean, we're satisficing here. We're not always going to be able to pick the absolute optimal method, but I think this is the meta learning idea, is that you want to kind of cover the domain and figure out, well, how do people do this? What are the different ways people use to do it? And so I was just saying, there's grids, there's tracing. The method that the Vitruvian Studios works on, triangulation, is as a kind of a basis point. But there's also a lot of people who there's sort of bottom-up methods where it's very much about accessing sort of the perceptual details. So sort of this line is roughly this angle. And so it's very much a feedback between seeing and action. And then there's what I'll call top-down methods, which are sort of like, well, I know the bone structure of a face. I know the approximate proportions of a face. So I'm going to draw approximately the right face. And then I'm just going to adjust based on what I think is distinctive about this person's face. That's actually how a lot of caricaturists and portrait drawers do it. So my point here is that— The
guy who draw people on the subway. So
So that's you have to do it really fast. So how do you do it? You have a good mental representation of approximately how people's faces are. So you can draw a kind of generic face, and then you adjust it to what the person's face looks like. It's not as accurate, but you can do it quickly.
But But you didn't give me the answer. Could you please elaborate on the searching process? What do I need to go? Do you go to check it up online, or you just listen? I need to speak with a face drawing artist.
Well, again, this is what I think you do. You Google how to draw faces, and then you click on different people who teach how to draw faces, and then you just you can skim over and be like, well, how are they doing it? You don't need to know the details of all the method, but just generally, what are the different kinds of methods? What are the different ways people approach this problem? How do people generally do it? Now, there is some difficulty here, because part of the difficulty of teaching is that as you develop a skill, more and more aspects of the skill become unconscious, and it's very difficult to display them. So, you might know from having spent 20 years drawing that the lighting of a surface is related to the sort of angle that the normal vector makes with the surface and the light source. And this is just intuitive to you that, well, obviously the shading has to look like this for this curve to be represented, but you may not be presenting that information to students. So this is a difficult process. But I think the idea here is that you want to do some kind of search. How long you want to search for depends on how long you intend to practice a skill. So this was this 10% rule that, if you want to just spend an hour doing it, then just go with the first one you find, and you'll probably do better than not. But if you wanted to spend 4 years practicing this craft, then maybe you might spend a month looking at all the different ways that people tackle this problem and how they think about it. And so that's a bit of a trade-off point. I tend to focus on kind of getting into doing things a little bit earlier. My feeling as well is that for portrait drawing, for instance, portrait drawing is going to be easier if you have a base drawing simpler things, which don't require such high levels of accuracy. And so I think a book like Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain would have been really good, because it teaches a method that's not too complicated, fairly easy to handle, and would be work for a lot of general situations. So similarly, if you're learning programming, your decision when you have zero programming ability is not like, how do I learn Jupyter and, scikit learning for machine learning. It's like, how do I learn to program generally? And then it's like, do I want Python or do I want C++? Like that's the element of your decision.
Yes. And then we go up online to what's the best programming language to learn in 2022, or what's the best programming book, or what's the best programming online course, or what's the best, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I keep asking you about like YouTube videos, and you keep like diverting away. So
well, YouTube videos are great. Yeah.
No, but you said, listen.
Yeah.
It seems that on the drawing,
yeah,
you don't start, okay, just watch the first 10 drawing videos if you know nothing about it, and then go, check some online course, or because you told me before, there is a huge difference if you are just going to take it as a hobby, and if you're going to like invest 4 years in doing this.
Yeah. Well, I think, I don't know whether it's a huge difference, but I do think that, like, as I said, you get better at a method by practicing it. And so if you knew you were going to be doing this at a very serious level, then it just means that the relative value of finding a really good method early goes up, right? But this is the problem, is that you don't, it's a search process. You don't know whether you're going to find a better method, right? It may just be that there's a simple method that people just have enormous quantities of practice, and that's how they get good at it. Or it could be like a really complicated method where it's, well, yeah, but you're just integrating huge amounts of knowledge about how faces are structured. And so it's, there's no trick to it. It's just like that. And so here's the thing. I think the idea is that the meta learning idea is that there is a map to a skill that you're learning. It's a map that involves procedures, things that you actually have to perform, ideas you have to understand, and then like little factual tidbits of knowledge that you need to know. Every skill is a little bit different. And there's a sort of a method there in the sense of like what it is that you need to do, what it is that you're doing to be good at this skill. And again, you need to do kind of a little bit of research. So, the portrait drawing example, again, there's no like library of different portrait drawing methods. You watch some videos, you look at some different people, kind of, how are they doing this? What do they think is important? If you really want to get serious, write to one of these people, just tell them like, what do you think is important to learn to get good at portrait drawing? And I mean, sometimes they can't tell you, sometimes it's all tacit knowledge. They've forgotten exactly what they did to learn it. But you can do this to sort of build your map. And I think with language learning, the same thing. What's a good resource for language learning? You type in what's a good resource for language learning. You'll have tons of people comparing Pimsleur to Duolingo, to Michel Thomas, to this, to this, this. You can go too far in this direction.
What's the best Anki deck?
Yeah, but I think it's a trade-off process. I think you want to know roughly, okay, these are roughly the methods people use. This is roughly the things that you actually have to do to be good at this skill. This is, you kind of have to break it down that way. That's the only way you can go forward. Now, I think there is this sort of problem. And as I said, with the portrait drawing thing, is that I thought that the process of drawing faces was mostly just a kind of, you just get more accurate sort of perceptually over time. And I no longer think that that's the method that people are using to do it. I think it's a combination of really good, let's say, bottom-up processing. So you're being very, very accurate in this angle is not this angle, it's this angle, right? And you're making those very fine distinctions. And then it's also top down. So you have a very good knowledge of what are typical ratios of faces, what is the typical way this works. So people study anatomy, people study this, they have all this knowledge so that when they are drawing a face, for instance, most people think the eyes are in the top 2/3 of the face, they're halfway. That's just like a very basic thing, but there's millions of these little like perceptual facts that you can use in drawing. And realistically, people use both. But the idea here is that, just doing a lot of practice is not going to be ideal for most skills. But if you can, yeah.
This is the picture on the left is day 1. The picture on the right is day 30. Now, day 30 is mesmerizing, but day 1 is not so bad at all. Is not so bad at all.
I didn't include it. I didn't include it because it wasn't fair, because it was a 30-day challenge. But the reason is that I'd first done this drawing on the right side of the brain, and I can show you the before picture from that. So this is like, I did the drawing on the right side of the brain, and I still felt like I wasn't that good at drawing faces. And that's why I did this challenge. But the previous picture, I don't know, maybe I can email it to you and you can include it somehow in the link.
No,
there.
Because this is great. And
actually, maybe if you scroll down, maybe you can see it. I don't think I posted it there, but the PDF, no, if you go up, I think it's on the PDF there.
Where's the PDF? Because I must tell you,
it's this thing. You scroll down a little bit. There's this thing here. Yeah, I think we did it because it was just such a large file. Okay, that first one. Okay, you zoom in there. Okay, so that right there is my actual but it wasn't part of the month, so I didn't feel it was fair to include it. But I'm just making the claim that it wasn't natural talent. That was my first picture.
This was before this was before drawing on the right side of the brain.
No, I don't know whether this was before. Maybe it was after. No, I think maybe it was before drawing on the right side of the brain. Yeah. So this was like my first attempt at drawing my face. And I've also spent a lot of time drawing too. So it's not that I have zero artistic aptitude or a background experience either. You know, I'm not, but that was where I started. And this is all the little sketches and stuff that I did. But my point is just that I did the drawing on the right side of the brain course, and that got me to the first picture you see on that 30-day challenge. But
drawing on the right side of the brain, of your brain, it's a book. It's also a course.
I don't know whether it's a course. It's definitely a book.
Yeah,
I'll give away the secret. Drawing on the right side of the brain is a bottom-up drawing process. The idea is that the reason we have difficulty drawing is that we typically perceive objects as three-dimensional entities. So when you see like this phone, you think rectangle, right? But if it's here, it's actually like a weird quadrilateral, like in a 2D projection. And so the trick is that you have to train yourself to see the angles that are there in the 2D projection that aren't there in real life. And so there's lots of little like kind of ways you can do that. I don't really like the right brain, left brain thing. I think that's BS, but the book is good. And so if you want to start with that would be a good starter resource to get you good at drawing things generally. And that's what got me to the first picture that you can see in that. And then the 30-day trial, definitely Vitruvian Studios would be the course I'd recommend for that. But I think, again, it's a challenge because how do you know what method to use? And that was an issue I had in the beginning, that like I would look at how to draw faces and people are suggesting the grid method, or they're suggesting like really basic, put the eyes in the middle and do this, which is like, yeah, it's okay, but you're not going to get a likeness. You're just going to get a face that looks human. So I think this can be a challenge. And I think there's a dialogue between doing the skill and like finding better methods that takes place in any self-education endeavor.
What are you doing these days? Because your YouTube channel, I think your last upload was 11 months ago. So what are you doing these days?
Yeah, I don't upload much to YouTube, unfortunately. It was just between writing articles, I just don't have enough time to make YouTube content. So I only usually do YouTube when there's something specific that needs to be video. So I think like my language learning experiment was one of those ones that is like, well, this is on YouTube, obviously. But these days I've been doing a lot of research on the learning transfer problem. And so this has been kind of occupying my life for the last year of getting really deep into this. And sort of, it's one of those issues that it seems like it should just be a kind of esoteric kind of like, oh, this is something academics worry about, but it actually goes, it's one of those questions that goes to the heart of learning, that transfer is essentially an answer to the question of what it is that happens when we learn. And so
let me just
turns out to be a much bigger question than
let me just explain. The idea is, is it possible that I learned something and this something that I learned, this new skill, shed light on different domains in my life? And can I transfer this knowledge to other domains? Because a normal IQ, an average IQ person can learn something and be extremely good. Elite chess player has an average IQ, but they can't take this one domain, which they are extremely good at, and transfer this knowledge to other domains as well. And this is like it's
a huge issue. And it cuts to the heart of what learning is, what schools are for, what we should be doing. What do we even learn from experiences? Like, how are you a better person than you were yesterday? It's all based on this. And so
it's all
I don't know whether I've come to any really strong conclusions yet, because there's lots of different viewpoints and a lot of these issues are still unresolved. But I think the picture that is held by cognitive psychology is not the picture that ordinary people hold about how skills are work and acquired. So this is very interesting to me, because
and we have transfer learning in artificial intelligence, which is quite different. And even even people in the industry, in the field say, you know, even the transfer learning in artificial intelligence, it's not that transfer. You know, it's from one domain to a similar domain, not to a whole new different domain. Now, Scott, Yaan, it's been a pleasure. It's been an honor. It's been like a roller coaster of ideas. Thank you so much. I usually end the conversation with one question about give me one tip to be more productive. But I have a theory that all these productive guru guys like Ali Abdal and Thomas Frank and all these other guys, they don't have kids. They don't have kids. and it's much easier. No, I think it's a
well, I didn't have kids and now I do. So I'm laughing. So I'm laughing out of
Josh.
Out of
you so you know what I mean. Josh Kaufman, when he had his girl, he said, okay, now I actually cannot learn anything. So what's your best productivity tip for guys who have kids?
Yeah, well, I do think that the challenges that I did when I was single and childless I would not be able to do them the same way now. But I think at the same time, I feel like this is not going to be a productivity tip. So unfortunately, I don't have the solution for anyone. But I think the right way to view it is that each phase of your life has opportunities and constraints. And the key to living well, in my belief, is to make the most of the opportunities and constraints. And so it is undoubtedly true that I cannot do the marathon projects that I used to do. I can't go and move to a different country and immerse myself in a language. And, you know, that makes things more difficult in some ways, but there's also these just amazing opportunities. I get to watch my son grow up and learn and, you know, I get to try to, in some ways, help him become a better person. And so I think the key to life is not just an optimization problem of like, there's one good thing that you're trying to maximize across all places in space. It's very much a local, you know, you're in this particular situation. What should you do to make the best of it? And so I think that there is a room for more humble projects and for more specific and more concrete projects. And I think there's a room for, you know, doing things that allow you to participate in your work and family. So I feel like one of the things that I've shifted more towards is learning projects that integrate with my work more, that they're not just totally isolated. I'm going to learn this thing that has no connection to my work. I know I was talking with Cal Newport, and he has 3 kids and he's super busy. And he was talking about, oh yeah, I was doing this sort of like a little electrical engineering, I think it was an electrical engineering project, but it was like with his kids, like he was doing it with them. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities in parenthood too. And you know, I love being a father and I think I wouldn't trade it for the world. And so I think there is sometimes this idea that all advice is universal and everyone can do that thing at the same time. But there's also the opposite problem where people are like, well, that's not my situation. So I hate this person who's saying this advice. You know, when I was single, I didn't have kids, the productivity advice of, you know, that I was following was different. And that's just okay. It's okay for it to be like that. And so I think that when you're approaching problems in your life, you have to think about what are my constraints, but also what are my opportunities? What are the things that are not just about getting more done in a day, but about having richer, more meaningful experiences? And I think if you have kids, there's plenty of those, you know, even if you don't have 40 hours a week to throw on a new project.
So much wisdom in just 1 hour and 45 minutes. Scott, Yaan, thank you so much. Guys, get his book. It's an incredible book. It's really an incredible book. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, bye-bye.